Welcome to What If Sleepstorian, soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts and carry you toward peaceful sleep. Before we begin, tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight, and, if you wish, what's on your mind. I read every note and love keeping quiet company across distances. If this brings you peace, a like and subscribe will help me make more nightbound stories. And if you'd like to support even further, you can buy me a coffee through the link in the description. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The fire in the grate at 221B Baker Street whispered its secrets to the November darkness, each flame curling upward like a question posed to the smoke-stained ceiling. Outside, London wrapped itself in fog, that particular thick yellow fog that seemed less a weather phenomenon and more a living thing, pressing its damp fingers against every window in the city, as if checking whether anyone inside still remembered the world beyond. The gas lamps along Baker Street flickered with their usual Victorian stubbornness, refusing to surrender entirely to the gloom, their light painting wavering circles on the wet cobblestones below, where a hansom cab clattered past, its horse's hooves striking a rhythm that belonged more to dream than waking. Inside, the sitting room held that peculiar quality of warmth that only comes when the cold outside makes itself known. The wallpaper, a faded pattern of acanthus leaves that had witnessed more mysteries than most of London's police force, seemed to lean inward, conspiratorial, as if the room itself were listening. The air carried the scent of burning coal mixed with the ghost of Mrs. Hudson's evening tea. Earl Grey, always Earl Grey, because she believed firmly that Darjeeling was too excitable for night time, and beneath that the faint chemical tang that never quite left the flat. A souvenir of Sherlock Holmes's experiments in the pursuit of truth, or at least in the pursuit of something to occupy his restless mind. Dr. John Watson sat in his preferred chair, the one whose cushion had moulded itself over the years to accommodate his frame with the loyalty of an old hound. He'd positioned himself at an angle that allowed him to feel the fire's warmth on his left side while keeping his reading material properly illuminated by the standing lamp beside him. The lamp itself was a marvel of modern convenience, its glass shade painted with an oriental scene that cast dancing shadows across the page whenever the flame within guttered. Watson wore his evening jacket, comfortable and worn at the elbows, and his slippers, the Moroccan leather ones that Holmes had once deduced the entire history of based solely on a scuff mark and a bit of dried mud. In his hands, Watson held the latest issue of the Strand magazine, that beacon of Victorian literary culture that had, in its way, transformed the very nature of how stories reached the English-speaking world. The magazine's pages were thick and creamy, the type set with a precision that spoke to the new age of mass printing, though the ink still had that fresh smell that Watson found oddly comforting, the scent of stories waiting to be consumed, of adventures pressed between paper leaves. The cover illustration showed a dramatic scene from someone else's tale, but Watson had turned past it, seeking his own familiar byline, that strange small thrill that never quite faded even after dozens of published accounts. The story he sought was The Adventure of the Naval Treaty, one of his more recent chronicles of Holmes's peculiar genius, and he was rereading it with the critical eye of a man who could never quite decide if he'd captured the truth of events or merely painted a romanticized portrait of his friend's methods. Holmes himself had complained in his usual manner that Watson had gilded the lily and inserted altogether too much atmosphere where cold facts would suffice. But Watson noticed that Holmes kept a carefully organised collection of these supposedly over-embellished accounts in a drawer of his desk, which suggested a different truth than his words conveyed. Watson reached automatically for his bookmark, that faithful leather strip that had accompanied him through countless volumes, countless evenings, countless quiet moments stolen from the chaos of a London medical practice and the whirlwind of Holmes's investigations. His fingers found nothing. He frowned, a small crease appearing between his brows, and looked down at the open magazine. The pages lay flat against his lap, unmarked, unguarded. The bookmark was gone. For a moment Watson simply stared, his mind performing that peculiar skip that occurs when a familiar object vanishes from its expected place. He checked between the cushions of his chair, running his hand into the crevice where things often migrated through some law of household physics that no scientist had yet adequately explained. Nothing. He glanced at the small side table, where his reading glasses rested atop a medical journal. No bookmark there either. He even looked at the floor, though he knew perfectly well he hadn't dropped it. The thing was too precious for such carelessness. The bookmark itself was unremarkable to anyone but Watson. It was a simple strip of brown leather, perhaps 4 inches long and an inch wide, with a small brass clasp at the top that had once been shiny, but had dulled to a warm patina over the years. His mother had given it to him before he left for university, one of those small, practical gifts that parents bestow upon children, venturing into the world, laden with more sentiment than their humble form suggests. On one side, in her careful hand, she had told his initials, J.H.W. On the other, nothing but the smooth wear of decades of use. Watson had carried that bookmark through medical school, through the heat and horror of Afghanistan, through the recovery from his wound, through the strange new life he'd built alongside a consulting detective in the heart of London. It had marked his place in anatomy texts and adventure novels, in poetry collections and railway timetables, in newspapers and journals and all the accumulated reading that makes up a thoughtful man's interior life. Losing it felt oddly bereft, like misplacing a small piece of his own history. "Holmes," Watson said, his voice cutting gently through the room's comfortable silence. "Have you seen my bookmark?" Across the room, stretched upon the sofa in a pose that suggested a man who had never met a vertebra he couldn't ignore, Sherlock Holmes lay wreathed in the smoke of his pipe. He had been lying thus for the better part of an hour, staring at the ceiling with the intensity most men reserved for examining evidence at a crime scene. The ceiling, for its part, offered only the usual arrangement of cracks and water stains that all London ceilings bore like badges of honour, souvenirs of the city's eternal dampness. Holmes's long fingers were steepled beneath his chin, and his eyes, those sharp grey eyes that could dissect a man's biography from his choice of tobacco, remained fixed upward. For a moment, Watson wondered if his friend had even heard him, lost as Holmes often became in the labyrinthine corridors of his own thoughts, chasing some problem or puzzle that had caught his formidable attention. But then Holmes spoke, his voice carrying that particular tone of mild annoyance he reserved for interruptions during what he termed his thinking hours, though Watson had never quite determined when these hours officially occurred, as they seemed to arise spontaneously and without warning. "Your bookmark," Holmes said slowly as if tasting each word, "is a strip of brown leather, approximately 4 inches by 1 inch, with brass fitments and your initials tooled on one side. You received it from your mother in 1872, before your departure for Barts. You have owned it for 21 years, during which time it has accompanied you through 3 continents and approximately 4,000 volumes of varying literary merit. You keep it religiously in whatever you are currently reading, and you have not misplaced it in all that time, which suggests an orderly mind regarding small sentimental possessions." Watson blinked. "Yes, exactly. So you have seen it?" "I have observed it virtually every evening for the past several years," Holmes replied, still not moving from his supine position. "It is as much a fixture of this sitting room as Mrs. Hudson's disapproving sighs, or the Persian slipper in which I keep my tobacco." "But have you seen it tonight?" Watson pressed, feeling that particular exasperation that came from Holmes's tendency to answer questions with observations rather than information. Holmes finally moved, lowering his pipe and turning his head toward Watson with the languid grace of a cat disturbed from its perch. "I have not. Is it missing?" "Yes," Watson said, hearing the note of concern in his own voice and feeling slightly foolish for it. It was, after all, merely a bookmark, a scrap of leather, easily replaced. Yet the thought of its absence created a small hollow in his chest, the way losing even minor totems of our past can unsettle the present. Holmes swung his legs off the sofa and sat upright with sudden interest, the pipe now forgotten in his hand. This was the transformation Watson had witnessed hundreds of times, the shift from languid disinterest to focused attention, as if someone had lit a lamp behind Holmes's features. His entire bearing changed. Where before he had seemed almost boneless in his repose, now he radiated a coiled energy, predatory and alert. "Missing," Holmes repeated, and Watson could almost see the gears turning behind those keen eyes. "Not misplaced. Missing. There is a distinction, Watson, and I suspect you have chosen your word with care." Watson shifted in his chair, the leather creaking slightly. Well, perhaps. It's just that this isn't the first time." Holmes's eyebrows rose, twin arcs of inquiry. Indeed? It vanished last week as well, Watson admitted, feeling now that he was making too much of triviality, yet unable to stop himself from continuing. I was reading the evening paper, stepped away to help Mrs. Hudson with a particularly stubborn window sash, and when I returned, the bookmark was gone from the paper. I thought perhaps I'd simply forgotten to place it, though I could have sworn I had. Then I found it 2 days later, tucked into a different newspaper entirely, one I'd already finished reading. Curious, Holmes murmured, and Watson recognised the tone. It was the voice Holmes used when something that should be insignificant began to reveal patterns that suggested otherwise. And before that, Watson continued, warming to his subject now, about 3 weeks ago it disappeared from a medical journal I'd been reading. I searched everywhere, rather foolishly I thought at the time, only to discover it a day later inside my copy of the Times, marking an article about, let me think, yes, about the opening of a new exhibition at the British Museum. Holmes had risen now and was pacing, his pipe trailing smoke like a locomotive building steam. The floorboards of 221B knew his stride well. They creaked in familiar places as he moved, a wooden percussion accompanying his thoughts. Outside, the fog pressed closer, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour. 9 o'clock, that threshold time when London began its slow transformation from the city of commerce to the city of shadows, where different rules applied and different stories unfolded. 3 times, Holmes said, his voice taking on that clipped, rapid quality that signalled his mind racing ahead of his words. 3 times in as many weeks. A pattern, Watson. You know how I feel about patterns. They're either coincidence or design, Watson offered, quoting one of Holmes's own maxims back at him. And you know how I feel about coincidence, Holmes replied with the ghost of a smile. You don't believe in it. I believe in it occurring approximately as often as snow in July, theoretically possible, occasionally observed, generally suspicious. Holmes stopped his pacing and turned to Watson with that penetrating gaze that had unnerved countless criminals and not a few innocent bystanders. Your bookmark disappears and reappears, but always in reading material. Always in something you've already engaged with or are currently reading. It doesn't vanish to the kitchen or the hallway or Mrs. Hudson's rooms. It stays within the sphere of your literary habits. Watson hadn't considered it in quite those terms, but Holmes was right. The bookmark remained always within the ecosystem of his reading, moving from one text to another like a bird hopping between branches of the same tree. Someone is moving it, Watson said slowly, the realization settling over him with an odd mixture of intrusion and curiosity. Someone with access to this room, Holmes added, his eyes scanning the familiar space as if seeing it anew, as if every shadow might conceal an intruder's traces. Someone who comes and goes with enough regularity that their presence is unremarkable. Someone who takes an interest in what you read, Watson, and who handles your possessions with sufficient care that you notice only the absence, never any damage or disturbance. The fire popped loudly, sending up a small shower of sparks that glowed briefly orange before fading to ash. Watson found himself looking at his magazine with new eyes, wondering who else had touched these pages, who else cared enough about his reading habits to engage in this strange, silent intrusion. Mrs. Hudson, Watson suggested, though even as he said it he doubted. Their landlady was many things, efficient, occasionally meddlesome, prone to strong opinions about proper mealtimes, but she had never shown any particular interest in what her lodgers read, so long as Holmes didn't set fire to it in the course of some experiment. Possible, Holmes conceded, but I think not. Mrs. Hudson's intrusions into our space, while frequent, are always purposeful. She comes to clean, to deliver meals, to complain about the chemical odours or the bullet holes in the wall. She does not linger over your reading material. Besides, she handles objects with the brisk efficiency of long practice. I suspect we would find more disturbance if she were our culprit. Watson nodded slowly. That matched his own sense of their landlady. A woman of action, not contemplation, whose relationship to books was primarily as objects to be dusted rather than read. Then who? Watson asked, though he was beginning to suspect that Holmes already had a theory, was already 3 steps ahead in this peculiar little mystery that had somehow blossomed from a missing bookmark into something that felt oddly significant, though Watson couldn't have said exactly why. Holmes didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crossed to Watson's chair and held out his hand in silent request. Watson passed him the magazine, watching as Holmes examined it with the same intensity he brought to bloodstains and cigar ash, those seemingly insignificant details that he transformed into narratives of human behaviour. Holmes's long fingers turned the pages carefully, his eyes scanning not the text but the paper itself, looking for... what? Watson couldn't say. Holmes held certain pages up to the lamplight, angling them to catch any impressions or marks. He smelled the spine of the magazine, a gesture that would have seemed absurd from anyone else, but from Holmes indicated merely another avenue of investigation. He ran his fingertips along the edges, feeling for irregularities, and then he stopped. His expression changed subtly, a flicker of something, surprise perhaps, or satisfaction, crossing his features so quickly that Watson might have missed it if he hadn't been watching closely. "Watson," Holmes said quietly, "when did you last read this particular issue thoroughly?" "I finished it 2 days ago," Watson replied. "I was rereading the naval treaty story tonight, checking some of my own phrasing. Why?" Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he carefully opened the magazine to a page near the middle and began to separate 2 pages that had been pressed closely together. There, nestled between them like a pressed flower, was Watson's bookmark. But it wasn't alone. Tucked carefully behind the leather strip were 3 newspaper clippings, each one trimmed with precise edges, each one folded to fit perfectly within the magazine's dimensions, without creating any bulk that might be noticed by a casual reader. Holmes extracted them with the delicacy of a surgeon removing something precious and fragile, laying them out on the side table, where the lamplight could illuminate them properly. Watson rose from his chair and moved closer, his heart beating with an odd acceleration that he couldn't quite explain. The clippings were small, no more than a few column inches each, and they were clearly from different newspapers. The type and paper quality varied among them. Holmes picked up the first clipping and read aloud, his voice taking on a neutral, almost clinical tone. "Dr. Watson's latest chronicle of Mr. Sherlock Holmes's adventures continues to captivate readers with its blend of mystery and camaraderie. The good doctor's narrative skill transforms the detective's cold logic into something warmer, more human. This is from the Pall Mall Gazette, dated 3 weeks ago." He set it down and picked up the second. In his account of the naval treaty affair, Watson demonstrates once again his gift for making the arcane accessible, for showing us not merely how crimes are solved, but why such solutions matter. From the Daily Telegraph, dated 10 days past. The third clipping was shorter. Watson's chronicles have become essential reading for anyone interested in the modern science of deduction, from the Morning Post, dated 1 week ago. Silence settled over the room like the fog settling over London's streets. Watson stared at the clippings, these small testimonies to his work, these fragments of praise that someone had carefully collected, trimmed, and hidden in his reading material like secret gifts. "Someone," Holmes said softly, "is following your published accounts rather closely, Watson, and they want you to know it, though in the most indirect manner possible." Watson picked up one of the clippings, feeling the paper between his fingers. Cheap newsprint, already beginning to yellow at the edges, yet preserved with obvious care. Someone had read these reviews of his work, had thought them worth saving, worth sharing in this strange, silent fashion. "But why hide them with my bookmark?" Watson asked, though he thought he might already understand. "Why not simply give them to me directly?" Holmes tilted his head, studying Watson with an expression that was surprisingly gentle, lacking his usual sardonic edge. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "because whoever is doing this is someone who cannot easily approach you directly, someone whose position or circumstance makes open communication difficult, or perhaps someone who is simply shy, shall we say, about expressing admiration." Watson felt a strange warmth in his chest, a mixture of flattery and unease. Someone in his orbit, someone with access to this very room, cared enough about his writing to collect notices of it, to place them where he would eventually find them, to engage in this peculiar, silent form of conversation. "The bookmark doesn't vanish," Watson said slowly, working through the logic. "It's being borrowed, moved from one piece of my reading to another, and each time it's returned it carries these messages." "Precisely," Holmes agreed. He gestured to the clippings with his pipe. "This is not theft, Watson. This is communication by someone who has chosen the language of books and papers to speak to you. Someone who understands that you live as much in the world of words as in the world of flesh and blood. The fire had burned lower now, the coals glowing deep red like rubies buried in ash. The room had grown darker at its edges, the lamplight creating an island of illumination around Watson and Holmes, while the corners retreated into shadow. Outside, the fog had thickened further, until the street lamps were merely suggestions of light, ghosts of illumination in the London night. Watson looked down at the magazine in his hands, at the bookmark that had witnessed so much of his life, and at these small paper testimonies to work he'd done, words he'd written, stories he'd shared with the world. Someone was reading those stories with care. Someone was marking them, noting them, celebrating them in secret. It should have felt invasive, he thought. It should have felt like a violation of privacy, this unknown person handling his possessions, reading over his shoulder metaphorically if not literally. But instead, Watson found himself oddly moved. In a city of millions, in the vast anonymous sprawl of London where people passed each other daily without ever truly seeing one another, someone had seen him. Someone had noticed not just the detective whose cases he chronicled, but the chronicler himself. Someone had thought his words were worth saving. "Holmes," Watson said quietly, "I believe we have a mystery." And Sherlock Holmes, who claimed to care nothing for sentiment and everything for logic, who insisted that emotion was the enemy of clear thinking, smiled, truly smiled, and replied, "Yes, Watson, I rather think we do. And for once, it's a mystery of the gentlest sort. The question is, shall we solve it, or shall we let it unfold in its own time?" Watson looked at the clippings, at his bookmark, at the magazine that had held them all like a keeper of secrets. "Let's solve it," he said, but gently. Outside, London dreamed its vast foggy dreams, and inside 221B Baker Street, two men contemplated the small mystery of attention, affection, and the silent languages of readers and writers, a mystery as old as the first story ever told, and as new as tonight's discovery. The fire whispered on, keeping its own counsel, and somewhere in the building someone who loved words moved quietly through their evening, unaware that they had just become the subject of the very sort of story they so enjoyed reading. Morning came to Baker Street the way it always did in November, reluctantly, as if the sun itself needed convincing that rising over London was worth the effort. The fog of the previous night had thinned but not vanished, transforming instead into a grey haze that hung between the buildings like cobwebs spun by some enormous melancholic spider. The light that filtered through the windows of Tourstourville was pale and watery, the colour of weak tea, and it fell across the breakfast table with the apologetic quality of something that knew it wasn't quite up to the task of illumination, but was doing its best nonetheless. Watson had slept poorly, his mind circling back repeatedly to the discovery of the clippings, to the strange gentleness of this intrusion into his reading life. He dreamed, in the fitful way one does when sleep is shallow, of bookmarks that moved of their own accord, of newspapers that whispered secrets, of invisible readers who left traces of themselves in margins and fold lines. Now, sitting at the breakfast table with Mrs. Hudson's excellent coffee steaming before him, and a plate of toast growing cold at his elbow, he found himself no less puzzled than he'd been the night before. The clippings lay on the table between himself and Holmes, arranged in chronological order as Holmes had insisted upon before they retired. 3 small rectangles of newsprint, their edges precise as surgical cuts, bearing words of praise that Watson had never sought but found himself oddly grateful to receive. He'd read them over several times now, not out of vanity, or at least he told himself it wasn't merely vanity, but out of a desire to understand what they revealed about the person who had saved them. Holmes sat across from him, already dressed despite the early hour, looking as crisp and alert as if he'd slept 12 hours instead of what Watson suspected was closer to 4. He'd positioned himself so that the weak morning light fell across the clippings at an angle, and he was examining them with a jeweller's loupe pressed to his eye, studying something that Watson couldn't discern from his position. The scissors, Holmes murmured, more to himself than to Watson, were small and sharp, embroidery scissors perhaps, or a lady's sewing shears. The cuts are too precise, too delicate for the heavy scissors one finds in most households, and look here, he gestured with one long finger, the person who cut these has excellent manual dexterity. Not a single jagged edge, not one wavering line. This speaks to either professional training in some precise craft, or to a naturally steady hand combined with great care. Watson leaned forward, squinting at the clippings. Now that Holmes pointed it out, he could see it too, the almost unnervingly perfect edges, as if each clipping had been excised from its parent newspaper with surgical precision. "What else?" Watson asked, finding himself falling into the familiar rhythm of their partnership where Holmes observed and Watson witnessed those observations, attempting to learn the peculiar art of seeing what was actually present rather than what one expected to see. Holmes set down his loupe and picked up the first clipping, holding it delicately between thumb and forefinger, as if it were a butterfly wing that might crumble at rough handling. "The paper is from the Pall Mall Gazette, as I noted last night. But observe the condition. No coffee stains, no finger smudges, no evidence of the rough handling that newspapers typically endure. This wasn't clipped from a paper found discarded on an omnibus or left crumpled in a waiting room. This came from a fresh copy, probably purchased specifically for this purpose, or at least handled with exceptional care." He set down the first and picked up the second. The same is true of the Daily Telegraph clipping. The paper is clean, barely creased, and this third one from the Morning Post, again pristine. Our mysterious reader is either remarkably fastidious, or these newspapers were acquired and clipped shortly after publication, before they could accumulate the usual wear of daily life. Watson absorbed this, his mind painting a picture of someone who bought newspapers, multiple newspapers, specifically to find mentions of his work. The thought was both flattering and slightly unsettling, like discovering that someone had been watching you sleep, but watching you with kindness rather than malice. "So we're looking for someone with access to this flat," Watson said, working through the logic methodically. "Someone with excellent manual dexterity, probably female given the type of scissors, someone who can afford to purchase multiple newspapers regularly, and someone who cares enough about my published work to collect reviews and notices of it." "An excellent summary," Holmes said, and Watson felt the small warm glow of his friend's approval. "But there's more. Look at how the clippings were folded." Watson picked up one of the clippings and examined it more closely. It had been folded twice, each fold creating a neat rectangle that would fit perfectly within the dimensions of his bookmark without adding noticeable bulk to whatever publication housed them. The folds themselves were crisp, almost architectural in their precision. "They were folded to be hidden," Watson observed, "not just to be stored, but to be concealed within my reading material without my noticing until the right moment." "Exactly," Holmes said, his eyes gleaming with that particular light that came when a puzzle began to reveal its architecture. "This person doesn't want to be discovered directly. They want you to find these clippings, but in your own time, through your own observation. They've created a sort of paper trail, if you'll forgive the pun, that leads nowhere except to their admiration for your work. It's communication that asks for nothing in return, gift-giving in its purest form." Mrs. Hudson entered then, carrying a fresh pot of coffee and eyeing the clippings on the table, with the practised disinterest of someone who had long ago learned not to question the strange artifacts that accumulated in her lodger's quarters. She'd seen everything from tobacco ash carefully preserved in envelopes to the severed fingers that Holmes occasionally kept in the icebox for comparative anatomy studies. A few newspaper clippings barely registered. "More coffee, gentlemen?" she asked, her Scottish brogue carrying the gentle reproof of someone who knew perfectly well that Watson's first cup had gone cold while he stared at scraps of paper. "Thank you, Mrs. Hudson," Watson said, offering her a grateful smile as she poured. The coffee was excellent as always, strong and dark, the kind that could wake a man from even the deepest fog of distraction. She moved about the room with the efficient grace of long practice, collecting plates, straightening the newspapers that Holmes had scattered across every available surface during his late-night reading, tutting softly at the state of Holmes's chemical apparatus which occupied one corner, like a particularly ambitious spider's web made of glass and rubber tubing. Watson watched her movements, suddenly seeing her with new eyes. Could Mrs. Hudson be their mysterious clipper? She certainly had access to the flat, and to his reading materials. She was in and out dozens of times a day, and her presence was so familiar that neither he nor Holmes truly marked her comings and goings anymore. But no, Holmes was right. Mrs. Hudson handled objects with brisk efficiency, not delicate reverence. When she straightened his newspapers, she did so with the same matter-of-fact energy she brought to all her tasks. There was no lingering, no tender attention. She cared for the flat and its occupants with genuine affection, but that affection expressed itself in practical ways, in good meals and clean linens and the tolerance of chemical experiments that would have sent any other landlady screaming for the constabulary. Besides, Watson had never known Mrs. Hudson to read anything beyond the household accounts and the occasional recipe in Mrs. Beeton's book of household management. She had opinions, certainly, strong ones, particularly about proper behaviour and the appropriate hour for breakfast. But those opinions didn't extend to literary criticism or the chronicling of detective work. As if sensing his scrutiny, Mrs. Hudson turned and raised an eyebrow. "Is something amiss with the coffee, Dr. Watson?" "Not at all," Watson assured her quickly. "It's perfect, as always. I was merely wool-gathering." "Well, gather your wool after you've eaten something," she said firmly, gesturing at his untouched toast. "You're thin enough as it is, and Mr. Holmes here," she cast a disapproving glance at the detective, "sets a terrible example by subsisting entirely on tobacco smoke and nervous energy." "Unnecessary," Holmes murmured, waving one elegant hand dismissively. "The body is merely the vehicle for the brain, Mrs. Hudson, and my brain functions optimally on coffee and contemplation." "Your brain will function optimally when it's housed in a body that hasn't collapsed from malnutrition," she retorted. But there was fondness in her acerbity. She'd been waging this particular battle for years and had learned to be satisfied with small victories. After she left, Watson dutifully ate a piece of toast, more to honour her concern than from any real hunger. His mind was elsewhere, circling around the mystery like a moth around a lamp flame. "Holmes," he said slowly, "how many people have regular access to this flat?" Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin, a gesture so familiar to Watson that it had become synonymous with thought itself. "Mrs. Hudson, of course. The boy who delivers the morning papers, the girl who brings up the coal for the fires, various tradespeople who make deliveries, the grocer's assistant, the butcher's boy, occasionally someone from the pharmacy when I've ordered chemicals. Your patients, when you see them here rather than at your practice. My clients, though they rarely venture beyond the sitting room, and then there's Mrs. Hudson's niece Clara, who helps with the heavier cleaning several times a week." Watson's mind snagged on that last name, Clara. He'd seen her, of course, in passing. A quiet young woman, perhaps in her mid-20s, with dark hair usually pinned severely back, and a tendency to make herself unobtrusive to the point of near invisibility. She moved through the flat like a ghost, tidying and polishing, and Watson realised with some chagrin that he'd never actually spoken to her beyond the occasional polite "good morning" or "thank you." It was a peculiar blindness, he reflected, this way that people of a certain class became almost invisible to those they served. Watson liked to think of himself as democratic in his sympathies, as someone who treated all people with equal courtesy regardless of their station, and yet he couldn't recall a single conversation of substance with Clara, couldn't have told you what colour her eyes were or whether she had siblings or what she thought about anything at all. She was simply there, in the way that furniture was there, noticed only in her absence when the floors went unswept or the windows accumulated grime. The realization made him uncomfortable. "Clara," Watson said aloud, testing the name. "Tell me about her." Holmes's expression suggested he'd been waiting for Watson to arrive at this particular station. "Mrs. Hudson's niece, as I mentioned, the daughter of Mrs. Hudson's late brother, who was a schoolteacher in Edinburgh before consumption claimed him. Clara came to London 5 years ago after her father's death, needing employment. Mrs. Hudson took her in, finding her work among various households in this neighbourhood. Clara is intelligent. Her father ensured she received an education that would have been remarkable for a girl of her class. She reads voraciously, from what Mrs. Hudson occasionally mentions, though whether our landlady approves or disapproves of this habit, I've never been entirely certain." Watson set down his coffee cup with a soft clink. "She reads." "She does indeed," Holmes confirmed. "Mrs. Hudson has mentioned finding her with books at odd hours, though Clara is always careful to complete her duties first. Apparently she haunts the lending libraries on her half-days off. Mrs. Hudson worries it will give her ideas above her station, by which I believe she means that Clara will become dissatisfied with domestic service and seek other employment." "And she's here several times a week," Watson said slowly. "Tuesdays and Fridays without fail," Holmes replied, "and occasionally on Saturdays if Mrs. Hudson requires extra help. She has access to the entire flat, including your room and mine. She dusts your bookshelves, Watson. She tidies your desk. She would know exactly what you're reading at any given moment. Watson picked up one of the clippings again, looking at it with new understanding. The precise cuts, the careful folding, the reverent preservation. These were the actions of someone who loved words, who understood their weight and value. Someone educated enough to read literary reviews, thoughtful enough to preserve them, shy enough to communicate only through this silent exchange of paper and attention. Small, sharp scissors, Watson murmured. The kind a woman might use for delicate work. Someone with a steady hand and an education. Someone with access to this flat who wouldn't be noticed coming and going. Someone who reads. Someone, Holmes added gently, who's been reading your published accounts with evident appreciation, and who wishes you to know it, but who cannot or will not approach you directly with such sentiments. The room seemed suddenly warmer, or perhaps it was merely that Watson felt a flush of something he couldn't quite name. To be seen, truly seen, not as Dr. Watson the veteran, or Dr. Watson the medical man, or even Dr. Watson the chronicler of Sherlock Holmes's adventures, but as a writer whose words moved someone enough that they collected evidence of their impact. It was oddly affecting. "What do we do?" Watson asked. Holmes rose from his chair and walked to the window, looking down at Baker Street where the morning was slowly assembling itself. A milk cart rattled past. A sweep called out his trade. The city was waking, shaking off the night's fog, beginning another day of its vast, intricate dance of millions of lives intersecting and diverging and never quite touching. "We watch," Holmes said finally. "We observe. We allow the pattern to continue revealing itself. Whoever is doing this has created a ritual, Watson, a form of communication that matters to them. To disrupt it, clumsy would be to destroy something rather lovely, don't you think?" Watson joined him at the window, looking out at the familiar street, at the London he'd come to know so well through his years of living here. Somewhere in this vast city, in this incomprehensibly complex web of human lives, someone was thinking about his words. Someone was cutting and folding and hiding little pieces of appreciation in his reading material, creating a secret conversation that asked for nothing except to be eventually noticed. "Yes," Watson agreed softly, "I think it would." And so they stood together, detective and doctor, watching London wake, contemplating the strange mystery of affection expressed through newsprint and leather bookmarks, through the silent language of readers and writers across the unbridgeable yet somehow bridged distance between admiration and acknowledgement. The bookmark, Watson thought, hadn't vanished at all. It had simply been travelling, carrying messages through the landscape of his reading life, waiting for him to understand what it was trying to say. He rather thought he was beginning to understand. The day unfolded with the peculiar ordinariness that characterized most of Watson's life at Baker Street, a gentle rhythm of routine punctuated by the occasional eruption of Holmes's energy when a case presented itself or an experiment reached a critical juncture. But today, no urgent clients came thundering up the 17 steps to their door. No telegrams arrived bearing cryptic summons from Scotland Yard. The city outside went about its business with the steady, unremarkable persistence of a clock ticking, and inside 221B, Watson found himself hyper-aware of every sound, every movement, every possibility that might reveal the identity of his mysterious correspondent. He'd positioned himself in his usual chair after breakfast, ostensibly reading the morning edition of the Times, but in truth his attention was fractured, part of his mind on the printed words before him, and part listening to the sounds of the flat, the creak of floorboards, the distant clatter of Mrs. Hudson in the kitchen below, the whistle of wind through the gap in the window frame that no amount of weather stripping seemed able to entirely seal. Holmes had vanished into his room after their conversation at the window, emerging an hour later with that look of contained mischief that Watson had come to recognize as the expression of a man with a plan. He'd settled himself at his desk with unusual industry, sorting through correspondence, organizing his notes on various cases, and, most tellingly, arranging a stack of papers in a conspicuously neat pile at the desk's edge. "What are you doing?" Watson asked, lowering his newspaper enough to observe Holmes's unusually tidy behaviour. "Spring cleaning," Holmes replied airily, though it was November and Holmes's relationship with tidiness was famously antagonistic. "Merely organising my papers. I've been meaning to do it for weeks." Watson raised an eyebrow. Holmes's idea of organisation typically involved stuffing important documents into the Persian slipper alongside his tobacco, or pinning urgent correspondence to the mantelpiece with a jackknife. This sudden devotion to order was as suspicious as it was unprecedented. "You're setting a trap," Watson observed. Holmes glanced up, and his eyes held that gleam of pleasure that came from being understood. "Not a trap, Watson. An invitation. I'm merely making my intentions clear to anyone who might be interested in such things." Watson looked more carefully at the papers Holmes was arranging. The top sheet was covered in Holmes's distinctive scrawl, notes on a recent case involving a stolen cameo. But beneath it, Watson could see the edge of something else, something that looked like his own handwriting. "Is that my manuscript?" he asked sharply. "It is indeed," Holmes confirmed, not looking up from his work. "Your draft of The Adventure of the Second Stain, which you left on my desk last week asking for my comments on factual accuracy. I've been remiss in returning it to you. I thought I'd leave it here, prominently displayed, in case anyone was curious about your work in progress." Watson felt a flutter of something in his chest. Anticipation, nervousness, curiosity all tangled together like yarn a cat had gotten into. Holmes was baiting a hook, using Watson's own work as lure, and Watson found he wasn't entirely comfortable with being the bait, even if he was also intensely curious about who might bite. "And what do you expect will happen?" Watson asked. Holmes sat back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "I expect that if our hypothesis is correct, if someone in this household is indeed taking such interest in your literary endeavours, they will not be able to resist the temptation to examine a work not yet published. Fresh words, Watson, unread stories. For someone who collects reviews of your published accounts, the opportunity to see your work before the rest of the world would be irresistible." "And you think they'll simply walk in here and read it while we're present?" "I think," Holmes said carefully, "that we should make ourselves absent for a few hours this afternoon. Create an opportunity. See what transpires." Watson considered this. It felt oddly invasive, like setting a trap for someone whose only crime was admiration. Yet he couldn't deny his own burning curiosity to know who had been engaging in this silent conversation with him, who cared enough about his words to preserve evidence of their reception. "All right," he agreed slowly. "What did you have in mind?" The plan Holmes devised was simple in its elegance. They would, he announced loudly enough for Mrs. Hudson to hear from the floor below, be attending a lecture at the Royal Society that afternoon, a talk on criminal anthropology that Holmes professed great interest in, though Watson suspected the lecture was entirely fictional. They made a show of preparing to leave, donning coats and hats, discussing the lecture's supposed start time, ensuring that anyone listening would know the flat would be empty for at least 2 hours. They descended the stairs with appropriate heaviness of tread, called out farewells to Mrs. Hudson, and exited onto Baker Street, where the afternoon had settled into that grey, indeterminate state that London afternoons in November seemed to favour. Not quite raining, but not quite dry, the air holding moisture in suspension like a breath held indefinitely. They walked to the corner, rounded it, and then Holmes, with the practised efficiency of a man who had conducted numerous surveys, led Watson through a narrow alley that connected to the mews behind Baker Street. They entered the building through the back entrance typically used for deliveries, climbed the service stairs in silence, and let themselves into 221B through the kitchen door, which Holmes had thoughtfully left unlocked. Mrs. Hudson was out. Watson had heard her mention an appointment with her dressmaker, and the flat above was quiet save for the settling sounds old buildings make, the conversation of timber and plaster that never quite ceases. Holmes led Watson to his bedroom, which had a view of the sitting room through a door left strategically ajar. They positioned themselves where they could observe without being observed, and then they waited. Waiting, Watson had long ago learned, was the least glamorous and most essential part of detective work. It required patience that Holmes did not naturally possess, and stillness that Watson's war-trained nerves sometimes struggled to maintain. They stood in the dimness of Holmes's room, watching the sitting room through the gap in the door, and the minutes accumulated with the slow, thick quality of honey dripping from a spoon. The flat was never entirely silent. Even empty of human voices, it hummed with small sounds. The tick of the clock on the mantelpiece, the settling of coals in the grate, the rattle of window glass when the wind gusted, the scurrying of mice in the walls that Holmes refused to eliminate because he found their presence character-building for the building. Watson could hear his own breathing, Holmes's slower, more controlled respirations beside him, and the beating of his own heart, which seemed unreasonably loud. Time stretched. Watson's leg, the one that had caught a Jezzail bullet in Afghanistan, began to ache from standing still. He shifted his weight carefully, trying not to make the floorboards creak, and Holmes glanced at him with a look that counselled continued patience. And then they heard it, the soft sound of footsteps on the stairs. Watson tensed. The footsteps were light, measured and careful. Not Mrs. Hudson's brisk tread, not the heavy boots of a tradesman. Someone was ascending to their floor with the quiet caution of someone who didn't want to be heard, or who was simply in the habit of moving through the world without drawing attention. The door to the sitting room opened slowly and a figure slipped inside. It was Clara. Watson had seen her before, of course, but always peripherally, always as background to the main action of his life. Now, watching her when she believed herself unobserved, he truly saw her for the first time. She was younger than he'd thought, mid-20s perhaps, with dark hair pulled back in a simple bun that suggested practicality rather than fashion. Her dress was plain, a serviceable grey that marked her status as clearly as a uniform, with a white apron tied at the waist. Her face was pale, fine-featured, with dark eyes that held an intelligence her station was meant to render invisible. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, as if gathering courage, or simply ensuring the flat was truly empty. Then she moved forward with purpose, crossing directly to Holmes's desk where the manuscript lay in its conspicuous display. Watson watched, barely breathing, as Clara approached the desk. Her movements were precise, economical, the movements of someone accustomed to completing tasks efficiently and well. She didn't grab at the manuscript or shuffle through it carelessly. Instead, she removed her work gloves. Watson noted they were worn but clean, mended at the fingertips, and folded them carefully before placing them on the corner of the desk. Then she picked up the manuscript. The change in her was immediate and remarkable. Her entire bearing shifted. Where before she'd moved with the brisk efficiency of domestic service, now she handled the papers with a reverence that bordered on religion. She held them as if they were something precious and fragile, as if words themselves had weight and deserved careful handling. She didn't sit. That would have been too presumptuous, too much of a violation of the invisible boundaries that separated her world from Watson's. Instead, she stood beside the desk, angling the pages to catch the grey afternoon light from the window, and she began to read. Watson could see her face in profile, and he watched as her expression transformed. Her eyes moved across the lines of his handwriting. He suddenly felt self-conscious about his scrawl, his tendency to cross out and revise. And something in her features softened. A small smile touched the corners of her mouth. Once she actually laughed, a sound so quiet it was barely audible, quickly suppressed as if she feared being overheard even in an empty flat. She read slowly, savouring the words, occasionally pausing as if to reread a particular passage. Her fingers touched the edge of the paper with extraordinary gentleness, careful not to smudge the ink, not to crease the corners. This was how one handled something valuable. This was how one touched something loved. Watson felt something catch in his throat, a tightness that might have been emotion, or might simply have been the held breath of witnessing something he wasn't meant to see. Here was his reader, his secret correspondent, revealed not through confrontation or interrogation, but through her own unguarded attention to his work. And she was so young, so clearly intelligent, trapped in a life that would never acknowledge that intelligence, that would require her to spend her days cleaning and polishing and remaining invisible, while her mind clearly hungered for something more. She read for perhaps 10 minutes, absorbed completely in the narrative, in the world Watson had created with words on paper. Then, reluctantly, she set the manuscript down, arranging it exactly as it had been, with the same precise care she'd shown in lifting it. But she didn't leave immediately. Instead, she stood there for a moment, her hand resting lightly on the desk near the manuscript, her eyes still on the pages. She seemed to be memorizing something, the words she'd read, perhaps, or simply the moment itself. Then she reached into her apron pocket and withdrew something small. Watson couldn't see what it was from this distance, but when she placed it carefully on the corner of the desk, near but not touching the manuscript, he saw it was a flower, a single violet perfectly preserved, its petals still rich with colour, though the season for violets had long passed. It must have been pressed in a book, saved from the spring or summer, kept for months for what? For this moment? for this silent offering of appreciation that asked for nothing in return? Clara stood looking at the violet and the manuscript for another long moment. Then she collected her gloves, slipped them back on with practiced efficiency, and turned toward the door. She paused at the threshold, looking back at the room, at the desk where Watson's words lay, at the violet resting beside them like a purple whisper, at the whole familiar space of 220B that she cleaned and tended but could never truly inhabit. Her face held an expression of such mingled longing and resignation that Watson felt it like a physical ache in his chest. Then she was gone, her footsteps receding down the stairs, fading into the larger silence of the building. Watson and Holmes remained still for several moments after she left, as if the scene they'd witnessed had cast a spell that required time to break. Finally, Holmes stirred, moving toward the door of his bedroom with his characteristic fluid grace. "Well," he said softly, "there's your answer, Watson." Watson followed him into the sitting room. The manuscript lay exactly where Holmes had left it, but now the pressed violet rested beside it. A small piece of beauty placed next to words, nature's art beside human art, a gift given with no expectation of acknowledgement. Watson picked up the violet carefully, holding it in his palm. It was perfect, preserved with obvious skill, the purple so deep it was almost black at the heart, fading to pale lavender at the edges. Someone had kept this flower for months, pressing it carefully, waiting for the right moment to give it. "She reads my stories," Watson said quietly. "She treasures them," Holmes corrected gently. "There's a difference. Many people read Watson. Few people treasure it. She collects evidence of your work's reception because she has no other way to express her own appreciation. She cannot approach you directly. The gulf of class between you is too wide, too rigidly policed by society's expectations. A domestic servant doesn't share literary opinions with a doctor and published author. The very suggestion would be improper, presumptuous. "That's absurd," Watson said, but even as he said it, he knew it wasn't. The rules that governed Victorian society were strict and largely unspoken, and crossing them carried consequences that someone in Clara's position couldn't afford. "Absurd, perhaps," Holmes agreed, "but true nonetheless. So she's found another way. She speaks to you through your bookmark, through collected reviews, through small gifts left where you'll find them. She creates a conversation that doesn't require her to violate the boundaries society has set for her." Watson looked at the violet in his hand, at the manuscript on the desk, at the whole peculiar arrangement of paper and flower and unspoken admiration. "What do I do?" he asked. Holmes smiled, that rare, genuine smile that transformed his usually austere features. "That, my dear, Watson, is entirely up to you, but whatever you do, I suggest you do it with the same gentleness she's shown you. This is a tender thing, this silent correspondence. Handle it carefully." Watson nodded slowly, his mind already working through possibilities, through ways he might acknowledge this gift without embarrassing the giver, without crushing this fragile, beautiful thing that had grown in the shadows of class and circumstance. Outside, London went about its business, indifferent to the small human dramas unfolding in its millions of rooms. But here, in 221B Baker Street, a mystery had been solved, not through deduction or interrogation, but through patience and observation, and the recognition that sometimes the most profound mysteries are matters of the heart. The violet rested in Watson's palm, purple as a bruise, delicate as a secret, precious as any clue Holmes had ever uncovered. The afternoon dissolved into evening with the gradual dimming that November days practiced, as if the sun were a lamp slowly running out of oil. Watson remained in the sitting room long after Holmes had retreated to his chemical experiments, standing by the window and watching Baker Street transform from its daytime identity into its nocturnal self. The lamplighters made their rounds, each gas lamp blooming into yellow life as they passed, creating islands of illumination in the gathering dark. The street sellers were packing up their barrows, and the traffic was changing character. Fewer delivery carts, more private carriages bearing London's comfortable classes to their evening entertainments. But Watson's mind was not on the street. It kept returning to the image of Clara standing in this very room, reading his words with such evident hunger and care. The violet still lay on his desk where he'd placed it, and he found his gaze drifting to it repeatedly. this small purple testimony to someone's quiet appreciation. He'd spent the hours since her departure wrestling with the question Holmes had left him with: what to do. The simple answer would be to acknowledge her directly, to thank her for her attention to his work, to perhaps give her copies of his published stories. But the more Watson considered it, the more he realized that such directness might destroy the very thing it meant to honor. There was something precious in the indirectness of Clara's communication, something that would be lost if dragged into the harsh light of explicit acknowledgement. She'd created a space where a working-class woman could engage intellectually with a gentleman's published work, where the rigid hierarchies of Victorian society didn't apply because the conversation happened entirely in the realm of the unspoken. To make it explicit would be to force it back into the world where those hierarchies held sway, where Clara was a servant and Watson was her employer's lodger, and the distance between those positions was measured in unbridgeable social miles. Holmes emerged from his room as the last light faded from the sky, bringing with him the acrid smell of whatever chemical combination he'd been subjecting to heat and observation. He'd changed his shirt, the previous one having apparently been sacrificed to science, and he carried that air of satisfied exhaustion that came after hours of focused experimentation. "Still brooding?" Holmes asked, though his tone was gentle rather than critical. "Thinking," Watson corrected. "There's a difference." "A fine one," Holmes replied, settling into his chair and reaching for his pipe. "Have you reached any conclusions?" Watson turned from the window, the violet catching his eye again. "I think," he said slowly, "that I want to continue the conversation she started, but I want to do it in her language, not mine. Does that make sense?" Holmes's eyes gleamed with approval as he lit his pipe, the match flaring briefly bright before settling into the steady glow of burning tobacco. "Perfect sense. You wish to respond without requiring a response, to acknowledge without forcing acknowledgement." "Exactly," Watson said, feeling relieved to have his half-formed thoughts articulated so clearly. "But I'm not entirely sure how to accomplish it." Holmes was quiet for a moment, smoke curling around his head like visible thought. The room had grown dark except for the fire and the single lamp Watson had lit, and in this dimness, with the street sounds muffled by fog that had begun to gather again outside, 221B felt removed from the world, a pocket universe where only the two of them existed. "You're a writer, Watson," Holmes said finally. "So write." Watson blinked. "You mean a story?" "Why not? She reads your stories. She collects reviews of them. She clearly finds meaning in your accounts of our adventures. So give her a story, but make it one that speaks to her specifically, that acknowledges what she's given you without requiring her to break the silence she's chosen." The idea settled over Watson like a warm coat, immediately comfortable and right. Yes, a story. He could write a character inspired by Clara, someone intelligent and observant, trapped by circumstance but finding freedom in books, in words, in the life of the mind. He could create a narrative that honoured her without naming her, that said, "I see you," without forcing her into the exposure of being truly seen. "I'll need time," Watson said, "to do it properly, to make it right." "You have time," Holmes assured him. "But there's another matter to address first, if you're willing." Watson raised an eyebrow. "What matters?" "The question of how she gains access to your reading material," Holmes said, his tone shifting into that of the detective presenting deductions. "We know she comes here Tuesdays and Fridays to help Mrs. Hudson, but the bookmarks have been moved and the clippings placed on other days as well, which suggests she has access to the flat at times beyond her regular duties." Watson frowned, considering this. "You think she's coming here when she shouldn't be?" "I think," Holmes said carefully, "that she may be taking advantage of Mrs. Hudson's absences to visit the flat for purposes other than cleaning. Not with malicious intent, obviously, but driven by her desire to engage with your work. The question is, when does she come, and does she know we're aware of her presence?" A thought occurred to Watson, sudden and clear. "You want to observe her again." "I think it would be illuminating," Holmes said, "not to catch her out or embarrass her, but to better understand the full scope of her, shall we call it devotion, and perhaps to create an opportunity for you to leave your response in a way she'll find it naturally, as part of your normal routine rather than as a deliberate gesture." Watson considered this. The idea of watching Clara again made him slightly uncomfortable. It felt voyeuristic, intrusive. But Holmes was right that understanding her patterns would help him craft a response that felt organic rather than forced. "When?" Watson asked. "Tonight," Holmes said promptly. "Mrs. Hudson mentioned she's attending the theatre with her sister this evening. She'll be gone from 7 until nearly midnight. If Clara has been visiting the flat during such absences, tonight would provide an ideal opportunity. And we'll be here, observing, ensuring we fully understand the situation before you craft your response." Watson glanced at the clock on the mantelpiece. 6:15. If they were going to do this, they needed to prepare now. "All right," he agreed. "What's your plan?" The plan was simpler than their afternoon surveillance, but required more patience. They would, Holmes explained, make a show of retiring early. Watson to his room, Holmes to his. They would ensure all the lamps were extinguished except the faint glow of the sitting-room fire, creating the impression that both lodgers had settled in for the evening and wouldn't emerge until morning. Then they would wait in Holmes's room, door ajar, watching for any sign of Clara's arrival. Mrs. Hudson departed at 6:30 in a rustle of skirts and a cloud of lavender water, calling up the stairs that she'd left cold supper in the kitchen, and would they please not burn down the flat in her absence. Holmes called back an assurance that was cheerful and entirely non-binding, and they listened to her footsteps recede, to the front door closing, to the silence that settled over the building like snow. They gave it half an hour, moving about the flat in their normal evening routine to maintain the illusion of ordinary behaviour. Watson settled in his chair with a book, though he couldn't have said afterward what book it was or what he'd read. Holmes played his violin for a time, drawing out a melancholy air that seemed to suit the foggy evening. Then, at precisely 7:00, Watson made a show of yawning loudly and announcing his intention to retire early with a medical. "Journal?" "Excellent idea," Holmes replied, equally loud. "I think I'll do the same. This damned fog always gives me a headache." They extinguished the lamps, leaving only the fire burning low, and retreated to Holmes's room. Once there, they positioned themselves as they had that afternoon, standing in the darkness where they could see through the cracked door into the sitting-room beyond. And then they waited. Waiting in the dark was different from waiting in the light. The absence of visual distraction made every sound amplified, significant. Watson could hear Holmes's breathing beside him, slow and controlled. He could hear his own heartbeat, the creak of the building settling, the distant rumble of traffic on Baker Street muffled by fog. The fire in the sitting-room popped occasionally, sending brief flares of brighter light across the familiar furniture, rendering it strange and shadow-haunted. Time moved differently in the dark. Watson had no idea if 10 minutes had passed or 30. His leg began to ache again, and he shifted his weight as quietly as possible. Holmes remained perfectly still beside him, a statue of patience, and Watson found himself envying his friend's ability to simply wait, without the mind wandering or the body protesting. Then, so faint he almost missed it, Watson heard the sound of the front door opening. His entire body tensed. Holmes's hand found his arm in the darkness, a silent counsel of continued stillness. The door closed again, carefully, almost soundlessly. Footsteps began ascending the stairs. Those same light, measured steps they'd heard that afternoon, but slower now, more cautious, as if the climber were taking pains to avoid every creaking board. The footsteps reached their landing and paused. Watson could almost feel the hesitation through the walls, the moment of decision, the gathering of courage. Then they continued, and the door to 221B opened slowly, admitting a slender figure silhouetted against the dimness of the hallway. Clara. She stood in the doorway much as she had that afternoon, but there was something different in her bearing now. She wasn't here for assigned duties. She was here because she'd chosen to be, driven by something stronger than obligation. She held something in her hands. Watson couldn't make out what in the poor light, and she moved with it carefully into the room. She crossed to Watson's desk, her path as certain as if she walked it in full daylight, as if she knew every inch of this room by heart. And perhaps she did, Watson thought. She cleaned here twice a week. She'd have memorized the placement of every chair and table, every hazard and obstacle. But she didn't move like someone navigating a dark room. She moved like someone coming home. At the desk she set down what she'd been carrying. Watson could see now it was a book, small and worn, and she stood there for a long moment, her hand resting on its cover. The firelight caught her profile, gilding it, bronze and shadow, and Watson saw her expression clearly, a mixture of longing and something that looked almost like grief, as if she were mourning something she'd never actually had. Then she noticed the violet. Watson saw her startle slightly, her hand moving to her throat in a gesture of surprise. She bent closer, examining the flower in the dim light, and even from across the room Watson could see her confusion. She'd left it that afternoon. Why was it still here, on Watson's desk, positioned as if it were something valued rather than something to be discarded or swept away with the daily tidying? She picked it up carefully, holding it to the firelight, and Watson saw the moment understanding dawned. The violet had been moved, but not far. It had been acknowledged, preserved, and placed deliberately. Someone had noticed it. Someone had cared enough to keep it. Her hand trembled slightly as she set the violet back down, and when she did, Watson saw her wipe at her eyes with her other hand. She was crying, he realized. Crying quietly, the kind of tears that come from being seen when you've spent your whole life being invisible. She stood there for several minutes, composing herself, and then she reached for the book she'd brought. She opened it carefully, and even from this distance Watson could see it was full of pressed flowers, a whole garden captured and preserved between pages. She selected one, another violet, or perhaps it was the same violet's twin, saved from the same long-ago spring. She placed it on Watson's desk beside the first, a continuation of the conversation, an answer to his unspoken acknowledgement. Then she opened her apron pocket and withdrew something else, a piece of paper folded small. She set it beside the violets, then seemed to think better of it, and picked it up again. Watson watched her war with herself, holding the paper, putting it down, picking it up, clearly torn between the desire to communicate more directly and the fear of overstepping. Finally, she tucked the paper back into her pocket. The violets would speak for her. Words, apparently, were still too dangerous, too direct, too likely to shatter the careful distance that allowed this conversation to exist at all. She stood looking at the desk for another long moment, memorizing it perhaps, or simply allowing herself this quiet moment of connection before returning to her usual invisibility. Then she picked up her book of pressed flowers, held it against her chest like a shield or a comfort, and turned toward the door. But she didn't leave immediately. Instead, she looked around the sitting room, at the chairs where Watson and Holmes sat, at the bookshelves crammed with volumes, at the chemical apparatus and the violin, and all the accumulated debris of their lives lived in pursuit of truth and mystery and the solving of puzzles both great and small. "Thank you," she whispered to the empty room, her voice so soft Watson barely heard it. "Thank you for your words." And then she was gone, slipping out of the room as quietly as she had entered, her footsteps receding down the stairs, the front door opening and closing with barely a sound, and then nothing but the fog and the fire and the silence. Watson felt something wet on his own cheeks and realized he was crying too, not from sadness but from the sheer beauty of what he'd witnessed. This quiet woman finding joy in words, creating a space for intellectual and emotional connection in a world that would deny her both, expressing gratitude for stories that had given her something she needed, something she couldn't get anywhere else. Holmes's hand was still on his arm, and Watson felt the gentle pressure increase slightly, an acknowledgement, a shared understanding. "Now," Holmes said softly in the darkness, "you write your story, Watson. You write it, and you make it worthy of her." Watson nodded, unable to speak, his throat too tight with emotion. The violets lay on his desk like small purple promises, and somewhere in the London night, Clara was walking home, carrying her book of pressed flowers and whatever small joy she'd found in this brief stolen visit to the world of words. He would write her story, he would make it beautiful. It was the least he could do. Morning arrived with the tentative quality of something that wasn't entirely certain of its welcome. The fog had lifted slightly overnight, transforming from its usual impenetrable yellow-grey into something more gossamer, more forgiving, so that the sun managed to send pale fingers of light through the window of 221B Baker Street. Watson woke early, earlier than was his habit, pulled from sleep by the urgency of purpose that had settled over him, like a second blanket during the night. He dreamed of stories, narratives that twisted and turned like the streets of London itself, characters who spoke in whispers and left flowers as punctuation marks, plots that resolved not with dramatic confrontations but with quiet recognitions. He'd dreamed, too, of Clara, though in his dreams she'd been less a person and more an archetype. The reader, the invisible audience, the person for whom all stories were ultimately written, the one who received words and transformed them into meaning. He dressed quickly, forgoing his usual leisurely routine, and emerged into the sitting room to find Holmes already awake, seated at his desk with a cup of what was probably cold coffee and an expression of intense concentration. The detective looked up as Watson entered, and something in his face suggested he'd been waiting. "I wondered when you'd surface," Holmes said. "I thought perhaps you'd sleep until noon, given the late hour of our vigil." Watson glanced at the clock. 7:30. "Couldn't sleep," he admitted. "Too much in my head." "The burden of the storyteller," Holmes observed with a slight smile. "You have a tale demanding to be told, and it won't grant you peace until you've told it." Watson moved to his own desk, where the 2 violets still lay, perfectly preserved, their purple almost shocking in the morning light. He touched one gently, feeling the paper-dry texture of the pressed petals, and something in his chest tightened with the weight of responsibility. Clara had given him these flowers, these small pieces of beauty, and he owed her something equally beautiful in return. "I need to talk to you about her," Watson said abruptly, turning to face Holmes. "About Clara. Not to solve the mystery. We've already done that. But to understand it. To understand her." Holmes set down his cup and gave Watson his full attention, that focused intensity that made one feel as if nothing else in the world existed except this conversation, this moment. "What would you like to know?" "Everything," Watson said. "You mentioned she's educated, that her father was a schoolteacher. Tell me more. What does Mrs. Hudson say about her? What have you observed?" Holmes leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin in that characteristic gesture of thought. "Clara Ashford," he began, "is 24 years old. She was born in Edinburgh, the only child of Thomas Ashford, who taught at a grammar school there. Her mother died when Clara was young. Consumption, the usual killer of the working poor in damp climates. Her father raised her alone, and by all accounts did so with considerable devotion." Watson settled into his chair, listening intently. Outside, Baker Street was waking up. He could hear the milk cart rattling past, a street vendor calling his wares, the everyday symphony of London commerce beginning its daily performance. Thomas Ashford, Holmes continued, believed passionately in education for all, regardless of gender or class. An idealist, in other words, and idealists rarely prosper in practical terms. He taught Clara as he would have taught any promising student: Latin, Greek, mathematics, literature, history. By the time she was 16, she had an education that would have equipped a middle-class boy for university, but which equipped her for precisely nothing that Victorian society deemed appropriate for a working-class girl. So when her father died, Watson prompted. When her father died 5 years ago, Clara found herself educated beyond her station, but without the means to capitalise on that education. Women's colleges exist, of course, but they require funds she didn't have. Governessing might have been possible, but her accent marked her as working class, and families want governesses who can teach their children to sound like the upper classes, not like Edinburgh shopkeepers. So she came to London, to her only living relative, and Mrs. Hudson found her work as a domestic servant. Watson felt a familiar anger rising in his chest, the same anger that had driven him to become a doctor, to serve in the Army Medical Corps, to dedicate himself to helping people regardless of their ability to pay. The waste of it. A brilliant mind relegated to scrubbing floors and polishing silver because the accident of her birth had placed her on the wrong side of society's arbitrary dividing lines. "Mrs. Hudson worries about her," Holmes said quietly. "She's mentioned it to me on several occasions, usually in the context of finding Clara reading when she should be sleeping, or spending her wages on books rather than on proper clothes or savings for her future. Mrs. Hudson is a practical woman, and she sees education without prospects as a form of torture. Better, she thinks, for Clara to accept her station and find contentment in it, than to nourish dreams that can never be realised." "But Clara won't give up the books," Watson said. It wasn't a question. "She can't," Holmes replied. "For someone like Clara, books are oxygen. They're the only place where her mind can stretch, can engage with ideas and narratives, and the full complexity of human experience. In the world of words, she's not a servant. She's simply a reader, as valid and valued as anyone else who opens those pages. Your stories, Watson, give her not just entertainment, but recognition. You write about loyalty and friendship and the triumph of observation and reason over chaos. You create worlds where intelligence matters, where paying attention is rewarded, where seeing clearly is heroic. For someone whose own intelligence must remain invisible, whose observations of the world around her must go unvoiced, whose clarity of thought is considered at best irrelevant and at worst threatening. Can you imagine what your stories must mean to her? Watson sat very still, feeling the weight of this understanding settle over him. He'd written his accounts of Holmes's cases for many reasons: to chronicle their adventures, to satisfy his own need to write, to earn some additional income, to entertain readers. But he'd never fully considered what those stories might mean to someone like Clara, someone for whom the very act of intelligent observation was a form of rebellion against a society that demanded she remain unseen and unthinking. "I don't know if I can do justice to that," Watson said quietly. "If I can write something worthy of what she's given me." "You won't know until you try," Holmes replied. "And Watson, don't make the mistake of thinking you need to write something grand or perfect. Clara doesn't want perfection. She wants recognition. She wants to know that she's been seen, truly seen, not as a servant, but as a person who thinks and feels and matters. Whatever you write it with that intention." Watson nodded slowly, his mind already beginning to shape the story, to find the narrative that would carry the weight of what he wanted to say without crushing it with obviousness or sentimentality. "There's something else," Holmes said, and his tone had shifted slightly, becoming more gentle. "Something I observed last night that you may not have noticed." "What?" "The book she carried. The one full of pressed flowers." Holmes paused, choosing his words with care. "I recognized it, Watson. It's a copy of A Study in Scarlet, your first published account of our acquaintance. She's been using it as her flower press." Watson felt his breath catch. His first story, that humble narrative he'd written so many years ago, uncertain whether anyone would care to read about a peculiar consulting detective and his new flatmate. Clara had taken that story and transformed it into something else. Not just reading material, but a repository of beauty, a place to preserve flowers, to create art from nature and narrative simultaneously. "She's been pressing flowers in my story," Watson said wonderingly. "For years, I suspect," Holmes confirmed. "The book is well worn, well loved, and every flower she's given you has come from those pages. She's been sharing her garden with you, Watson, the garden she's cultivated between the lines of your words." The room seemed to shimmer slightly, or perhaps it was just moisture in Watson's eyes. He blinked it away, overwhelmed by the perfect circularity of it. He'd given Clara stories, and she'd transformed them into a garden, and now she was returning that garden to him flower by flower, completing a cycle of giving and receiving that had its own elegant logic. "I know what to write," Watson said suddenly, the certainty of it hitting him like a physical force. "I know exactly what to write." Holmes smiled, that rare expression of genuine warmth that transformed his austere features. "Then you'd better get started. We have established that Clara comes here Fridays to help Mrs. Hudson with the heavy cleaning. Today is Wednesday. That gives you 2 days to write your story and leave it where she'll find it." Watson rose from his chair, energy suddenly coursing through him. 2 days. He could work for 2 days. He'd written stories in less time, though never one that mattered quite so much. "Holmes," he said, pausing at his desk, "thank you for seeing this, for helping me understand it." Holmes waved a dismissive hand, but Watson could see he was pleased. "Understanding is what I do, Watson. Usually I apply it to crimes, but the human heart presents puzzles quite as complex as any locked room or missing will. Besides," and here his smile became almost mischievous, "I have a certain investment in ensuring that my chronicler remains inspired. Your accounts of our work have brought me more interesting cases than any advertisement could have managed. If Clara's appreciation helps you continue writing, then I benefit as well." Watson laughed, recognizing Holmes's deflection of sentiment into practicality, a habit as characteristic as his pipe or his violin. But underneath the practical justification, Watson could see genuine care, for Clara's situation, for the delicate mystery they'd uncovered, for the strange and beautiful conversation that had been happening in silence within these very rooms. He turned to his desk, pulling out fresh paper, uncapping his ink. The violets lay beside his writing materials, and he positioned them carefully where he could see them as he worked. They would be his touchstones, his reminder of why he was writing and for whom. The story took shape in his mind like fog condensing into form. Not a mystery this time, not an account of Holmes's deductive brilliance, but something quieter, more personal. A story about a character he would call Sarah, a young woman of intelligence and observation who worked in the household of a detective, who found in the detective's chronicled adventures a window into a larger world, who learned to see herself as the detective saw others, clearly, completely, without the obscuring lens of social prejudice. It would be a story about being seen, about the radical act of recognition, about how attention, truly given, transforms both the observer and the observed, and it would be for Clara, though her name would never appear in it. She would know, though. She would read it and recognise herself, recognise the conversation they'd been having without words, recognise that her silent appreciation had been received and valued and returned in kind. Watson began to write, his pen moving across the page with unusual fluency, the words flowing as if they'd been waiting inside him all along, needing only this particular moment, this particular purpose to emerge. Holmes, tactful for once, gathered his things and departed the sitting room, leaving Watson alone with his thoughts and his violets, and the blank pages that would soon carry a story written not for publication or profit, but as an answer to a question asked in pressed flowers and newspaper clippings, and the silent language of readers and writers across the unbridgeable, yet somehow bridged distance between admiration and acknowledgement. Outside, London continued its vast, indifferent dance, millions of lives intersecting and diverging, most of them never truly seeing each other, never truly connecting. But here, in 221B Baker Street, a connection had been made, a conversation had been recognised, and a story was being born from that recognition, a gift given in return for gifts received, words offered to someone who had shown him what words could mean. Watson wrote through the morning and into the afternoon, barely noticing when Mrs. Hudson brought him lunch, when the light shifted from pale morning clarity to the warmer tones of afternoon. He was lost in the work, in the careful crafting of a narrative that needed to be both subtle and clear, both fictional and true, both a story and a letter, both art and acknowledgement. By the time the winter darkness began to gather outside his window, he had the bones of it, the structure, the characters, the arc of recognition that would mirror Clara's own experience. Tomorrow he would refine it, polish it, make it worthy of her. And on Friday, he would leave it on his desk, prominently displayed for a reader who had never asked for anything except the privilege of reading, and who would find in its pages the answer she had never dared to hope for. Yes, I see you. Yes, your attention matters. Yes, you are valued. The violets seemed to glow in the lamplight, purple promises kept and new promises being made, and Watson smiled as he wrote, feeling the peculiar satisfaction that comes from using words not just to tell a story, but to change a life. Thursday passed in a blur of revision and refinement. Watson rose early again, driven by the same urgent purpose that had pulled him from sleep the previous morning, and he spent the entire day at his desk, working and reworking the story until every word felt precisely right, every sentence balanced between clarity and subtlety, every paragraph carrying the weight of what he needed to say without collapsing under its own earnestness. Holmes, demonstrating an unexpected delicacy, made himself scarce for much of the day. He departed after breakfast on some vague errand involving the British Museum and didn't return until late afternoon, by which time Watson had filled his wastepaper basket with false starts and abandoned paragraphs, the detritus of a writer seeking exactly the right approach to a story that mattered more than most. The narrative he'd crafted centred on Sarah, a young woman employed in the household of a scholar and his companion who chronicled the scholar's work. Sarah found in those chronicles not just entertainment, but a model for how to observe the world with clarity and intelligence. The story followed her quiet journey of self-recognition, of learning to value her own observations, of understanding that her mind was not a liability or an irrelevance, but something precious. Regardless of what society might say about women of her class and station, it wasn't a mystery story in the traditional sense. There were no crimes to solve, no villains to unmask. Instead, It was a story about the mystery of being seen, about how recognition transforms us, about the quiet heroism of continuing to think and observe and care about ideas even when the world insists you shouldn't. Watson had woven in small details that Clara would recognise. A character who pressed flowers in books, who collected newspaper clippings, who moved through a household like a ghost, but who possessed a rich interior life that the household's occupants had failed to notice. And at the story's end, he'd written a scene where the scholar's companion left a new manuscript on his desk with a note. For my most faithful reader, whose attention has been the greatest gift a writer could receive. It was perhaps too direct, too obvious in its intention. But Watson had decided that subtlety, while elegant, risked being missed entirely. Clara needed to know, without any possibility of doubt, that she had been seen, that her silent appreciation had been received and valued and returned. By Thursday evening, Watson had a clean copy of the story, written out in his clearest hand on good paper. It ran to perhaps 12 pages, approximately 3,000 words, and he'd titled it simply The Faithful Reader. He read it through one final time as the lamps were being lit along Baker Street, checking for any errors in transcription, any awkward phrasings he'd missed in earlier drafts. It was good, he thought. Not his best technical writing, perhaps. His accounts of Holmes's cases had a certain polish born of practice, and his medical training's emphasis on clear, precise description. But this story had something his other work often lacked. It had heart. It had been written not to entertain anonymous readers, but to speak directly to one specific person, and that specificity gave it an emotional resonance that transcended technical perfection. Holmes returned as Watson was setting the manuscript aside, blowing in with the evening fog and carrying a package wrapped in brown paper. "Finished?" Holmes asked, unwinding his scarf and draping it over the back of a chair with his characteristic disregard for proper hooks and coat stands. "Finished," Watson confirmed, "or as finished as it's going to be. I could tinker with it indefinitely, but at some point one must simply commit to the work as it stands." Holmes nodded approvingly. "Perfection is the enemy of completion, as someone wise probably said at some point. May I read it?" Watson hesitated, feeling suddenly protective of the manuscript, as if sharing it even with Holmes might somehow dilute its intended impact on Clara. But he recognised the impulse as irrational, and gestured toward the pages. "Of course." Holmes settled into his chair and read in silence while Watson pretended to browse the evening paper, though in truth he was watching his friend's face for reactions, for any sign of approval or criticism. Holmes was an exacting reader, and while Watson valued that quality in general, at this moment he found it nerve-wracking. Finally, Holmes set down the manuscript and looked at Watson with an expression that was difficult to read, something between approval and a deeper, more complex emotion that Watson couldn't quite identify. "It's beautiful, Watson," Holmes said quietly. "Honest and kind and exactly what it needs to be. She'll understand it. More than that, she'll treasure it." Watson felt relief wash over him like warm water. "You think so?" "I know so," Holmes replied. "You've written her a letter disguised as a story, or perhaps a story that functions as a letter. Either way, you've given her the recognition she's been seeking without forcing her to step out of the safe space she's created. It's a masterwork of empathetic communication." "That might be overstating it," Watson said, but he was pleased nonetheless. Holmes rose and crossed to the package he'd brought in, unwrapping it to reveal a slim leather portfolio. "I took the liberty of purchasing this today. I thought you might want something more formal than simply leaving the manuscript loose on your desk. This way, it will be clear that the story is a deliberate gift, not just a work in progress that happens to be lying about." Watson took the portfolio, running his fingers over the smooth leather. It was simple but elegant, the kind of thing that suggested care without ostentation. "Thank you, Holmes. This is perfect." "There's a card as well," Holmes said, producing a small envelope from his pocket. "I thought you might want to include a brief note. Nothing elaborate, just enough to make your intention clear." Watson opened the envelope and found a plain card, good quality paper with no decoration. He sat at his desk and considered what to write. Too much would be overwhelming. Too little might leave Clara uncertain about the manuscript's purpose. Finally he wrote simply, "For my most faithful reader, your attention to my work has been noticed and deeply appreciated. These words are my small way of saying thank you. J.H.W." He slipped the card and manuscript into the portfolio and set it prominently on his desk, positioned where Clara couldn't possibly miss it when she came to clean tomorrow. The violets still lay nearby, and he arranged them so they framed the portfolio like a purple benediction. "And now we wait," Watson said. "And now we wait," Holmes agreed. Friday arrived with a cold clarity that seemed to sharpen the edges of everything. The fog had finally lifted entirely, leaving behind a sky of pale blue and air so crisp it seemed to ring like crystal. Watson woke to find frost etched on the windows in patterns that looked like ferns or feathers, nature's brief artwork before the sun melted it away. He'd slept poorly, his mind too active with anticipation, and a nervousness he couldn't quite justify. Clara would find the portfolio, she would read the story, she would understand it. Or she wouldn't, and the whole gesture would fall flat, would seem presumptuous or patronizing or simply odd. There was no way to know except to wait and see. Mrs. Hudson arrived at her usual time, and shortly after, Watson heard the lighter footsteps that signalled Clara's arrival. His heart rate increased absurdly, as if he were waiting for news of a military campaign rather than simply for a woman to find a story he'd left for her. He forced himself to remain in his bedroom, pretending to organise his medical journals, though in truth he was simply moving them from one stack to another, without any real purpose. Holmes, meanwhile, had positioned himself in the sitting room with his chemistry apparatus, apparently absorbed in some experiment involving copper sulfate and various acids, but Watson suspected his friend was as alert to Clara's presence as he was. Time crawled. Watson heard the sounds of Clara moving through the flat. The swish of her skirts, the soft clatter of cleaning implements, the occasional creak of floorboards. She was in the sitting room now, dusting most likely, or perhaps sweeping the hearth. Would she notice the portfolio immediately, or would it take her some time? Then silence. The absence of sound was so complete that Watson found himself holding his breath, straining to hear anything, any indication of what was happening in the next room. He moved quietly to his door, opening it just enough to see into the sitting room. Clara stood at his desk, the portfolio open in her hands, the manuscript visible within it. She'd found the card. Watson could see it resting on the desk where she'd placed it after reading. Her face, in profile, showed an expression of such intense emotion that Watson felt almost guilty for witnessing it. This was a private moment, a personal revelation, and yet here he was, watching like some voyeur of the soul. She was reading the story. Her lips moved slightly as she followed the words, and Watson could see her hands trembling, causing the pages to flutter like leaves in a breeze. She read slowly, carefully, absorbing every word, and as she progressed through the pages, Watson saw tears begin to track down her cheeks, silent and steady. But these weren't tears of sadness. Watson had seen enough grief in his medical practice and military service to recognise its particular character. These were tears of recognition, of gratitude, of the overwhelming emotion that comes when someone truly sees you for the first time and values what they see. She reached the end of the story and stood for a long moment, simply holding the manuscript, her eyes closed, tears still falling. Then she carefully, reverently, placed the pages back in the portfolio and closed it. She picked up the card and read it again, her fingers tracing Watson's signature as if the letters themselves were precious. Watson saw her reach into her apron pocket, that repository of small treasures, and withdraw something. It was another note, he realised, probably the same one she'd almost left the other night before thinking better of it. She looked at it for a long moment, clearly wrestling with herself, with the question of whether to finally break her silence and communicate directly. Then, with what looked like a decision made, she placed the note on the desk beside the portfolio. She stood there a moment longer, her hand resting lightly on the leather cover, and then she whispered something Watson couldn't quite hear, but he thought it might have been "thank you" again, those same words she'd spoken into the empty room earlier that week. Then she resumed her cleaning, moving with her usual efficiency, but with something different in her bearing, something lighter, as if a weight she'd been carrying had been lifted, or as if she'd been given permission to stand a little straighter, to take up a little more space in the world. Watson waited until he heard her descend the stairs before emerging from his room. Holmes had abandoned his experiment and was standing near the desk looking down, at the note Clara had left. "Well?" Watson asked, though he almost didn't want to know. What if the note contained disappointment or criticism? What if his gesture had somehow missed its mark? Holmes picked up the note and handed it to Watson without a word. Watson unfolded it with trembling fingers. The handwriting was beautiful, careful copperplate, the kind taught to children in good schools, elegant and precise. It read, "Dear Dr. Watson, I cannot adequately express what your words have meant to me over these years. In your stories, I have found not just entertainment but encouragement, a reminder that intelligence and observation matter, that seeing clearly is valuable, that paying attention to the world is not a waste of time or energy but something essential and good. I know I should not have taken such liberties with your possessions, moving your bookmark and leaving my small tokens of appreciation. I hope you will forgive the presumption. I only wanted you to know that someone was reading, truly reading, and finding in your accounts of Mr. Holmes's work a kind of companionship that has made my own circumstances more bearable. Your new story has given me something I never expected and perhaps did not deserve, the knowledge that I have seen, not as a servant or as someone to be pitied for my station, but as a reader, as a person whose attention has value. You have given me a great gift, and I will treasure it always. I will continue to read everything you write, if I may, and I will continue to leave small signs of my appreciation if you do not object. But I understand now that I need not hide quite so much. You have shown me that being seen is not always dangerous, that sometimes it is the most wonderful thing in the world. With deepest gratitude and respect, Clara Ashford." Watson read the note twice, 3 times, feeling his own eyes grow damp. The formality of her language, the careful politeness that marked the enormous distance between their social positions, even as she tried to bridge it, it broke his heart and mended it simultaneously. "What will you do?" Holmes asked gently. Watson folded the note carefully and set it beside the portfolio. "I'll write back," he said. "A brief note, I think. Not overly familiar. I don't want to make her uncomfortable, but warm. Acknowledging her letter, encouraging her to continue her reading, perhaps offering to leave other manuscripts for her to preview, creating an ongoing correspondence through our mutual love of words." "And the bookmark?" Holmes prompted with a slight smile. Watson laughed softly. "The bookmark can continue its travels. Let it carry messages between us, her clippings and flowers, my stories and notes. It's become rather more than a bookmark now, hasn't it? It's become a conversation, a connection, a small rebellion against the rigid walls that society tries to build between people." Holmes nodded approvingly. "There are many kinds of mysteries in this world, Watson. Some involve crimes and villains and dramatic revelations, but some involve the simple, profound mystery of human connection, how we reach across the distances between us, how we signal to each other that we're not alone, that we're seen and valued. This mystery you've solved not through deduction but through empathy. I find that rather beautiful." Watson looked at the portfolio, at the note, at the violets still resting on his desk like small purple witnesses to this entire strange and wonderful occurrence. "So do I," he said quietly. "So do I." Outside, London bustled through its Friday routine, millions of lives unfolding in their separate spheres. But here, in 221B Baker Street, a connection had been acknowledged, a conversation had moved from silence into tentative speech, and a young woman who had spent her life being invisible had been given the greatest gift Watson could offer, the simple recognition that she existed, that she mattered, that her attention to his words had transformed them into something more than just stories, into bridges between two people who might never have truly met without the intercession of bookmarks and pressed flowers and the shared language of readers and writers. Watson sat down and began to compose his reply, choosing each word with the same care Clara had shown in her note, wanting to strike the right balance between warmth and propriety, between acknowledgement and respect for the boundaries that would always exist between them. But within those boundaries, he was discovering there was room for something genuine, something valuable, something that made both their lives richer. He wrote, and somewhere in the building below, Clara continued her work, carrying with her the knowledge that she had been seen. It was enough, more than enough. It was everything. Winter deepened over London with the inexorable progression of a glacier, each day shorter than the last, the darkness accumulating in the corners of the city like sediment settling at the bottom of a river. December arrived with frost that painted the windows of 221B Baker Street in ever more elaborate patterns, and with it came the particular quality of cold that seemed to seep through brick and mortar, through wool and leather, settling into bones and making the fire in the grate less a luxury than a necessity for civilized existence. But inside the sitting room, where the flames crackled and hissed their perpetual commentary on the wood that fed them, Watson found himself warmer than the temperature alone could account for. The warmth came from something less tangible than coal and kindling. It came from the quiet correspondence that had bloomed in the weeks since he'd left his story for Clara, a correspondence conducted not through conventional letters, but through the continued journey of his leather bookmark and the small treasures it now regularly carried. The bookmark had indeed continued its travels, but its movements had taken on a new character, a new intentionality. Where before Clara's contributions had been furtive, hidden, uncertain, now they arrived with a kind of joyful confidence. She no longer concealed her clippings so carefully, no longer folded them to invisible thinness. Instead, she left them openly tucked into whatever Watson was currently reading, accompanied by small notes written in her elegant copperplate hand. The notes were brief, always respectful, but they sparkled with intelligence and observation. She might comment on a particular phrase in one of his published stories, or point out a detail in one of Holmes's cases that she'd found particularly clever, or share her own reaction to a passage. "The description of the fog in your account of the Boscombe Valley mystery reminded me of Edinburgh mornings," one note read. "I could almost taste the dampness, feel it settling on my skin. You have a gift for making the weather itself into a character." Watson had responded in kind, leaving his own notes for her to find. Brief comments about his writing process, questions about her own reading, gentle encouragement to share more of her thoughts. He was careful to maintain appropriate boundaries, never presuming too much familiarity, always respectful of the social distance that separated them. But within those boundaries, a genuine friendship had begun to take shape, built entirely on their shared love of words and stories and the ways that narrative could illuminate the world. Holmes observed this developing correspondence with an expression that might have been amusement, or might have been approval. With Holmes, it was often difficult to distinguish between the two. He'd taken to occasionally adding his own notes to the bookmark's cargo, brief postscripts to Watson's comments or sardonic observations about Watson's tendency to romanticize the facts of their cases. Clara, in turn, had begun leaving notes addressed to both of them, creating a three-way conversation that existed entirely in the margins of Watson's reading life. It was the third week of December, with Christmas approaching like a distant shore visible through fog, when Watson noticed something new in the pattern of Clara's contributions. The clippings she left were no longer just reviews of his published work. Now they included other articles, other pieces of writing that had caught her attention, a poem from the Strand, an essay about the British Museum's new acquisitions, a review of a lecture on archaeology at the Royal Society. She was sharing her own intellectual life with him, Watson realised, not just responding to his work, but inviting him into her world, showing him what captured her interest, what made her think and feel and wonder. It was a form of trust, he understood, a willingness to be known not just as an admirer of his writing, but as a person with her own tastes, her own curiosity, her own interior landscape. He found himself looking forward to, discovering what Clara had left, the way one might look forward to letters from a friend in a distant country. Each new clipping, each pressed flower, each brief note was a small window into her life, her mind, her way of seeing the world, and in sharing his own responses, in leaving his manuscripts for her to read before publication, in crafting his stories with the knowledge that she would be among their first readers, Watson felt his own work deepening, becoming more thoughtful, more intentional. "You're writing differently," Holmes observed one evening as Watson sat at his desk, working on a new account of their recent investigation into a stolen diamond. "More carefully, perhaps, or more honestly. I'm not quite certain which." Watson looked up from his manuscript, considering. "I think," he said slowly, "I'm writing with a clearer sense of my audience. Before, I wrote for some abstract idea of the reader, a faceless mass of people I would never meet. Now I write knowing that Clara will read these words, will engage with them thoughtfully, and will notice not just the mystery, but the craft of how it's told. It makes me more conscious of my choices, more deliberate in my language." "Better then," Holmes said simply. "Accountability improves all endeavours, even artistic ones, especially artistic ones, perhaps. It's too easy to become sloppy when no one is paying close attention." Clara pays very close attention, Watson agreed with a smile. As if summoned by her name, a small folded note appeared beneath Watson's door, slipped through the gap between wood and floor with the silent efficiency that characterized all of Clara's communications. Watson retrieved it and unfolded the paper, recognizing her handwriting immediately. "Dr. Watson," it read, "I wonder if I might ask a favour. I've been reading notices of a new exhibition at the British Museum, a collection of illuminated manuscripts from medieval monasteries. The reviews suggest it's quite remarkable. I would very much like to see it, but I confess I feel intimidated by the prospect of visiting such a grand institution alone. I know it's presumptuous to ask, but if you and Mr. Holmes ever plan to attend the exhibition, and if you wouldn't find my presence an imposition, I would be deeply grateful for the opportunity to accompany you. I understand completely if this is too much to ask. C.A." Watson read the note twice, feeling a mixture of pleasure and concern. Clara was asking to meet them publicly, to step outside the safe confines of their written correspondence into actual social interaction. It was a brave request, and it touched him that she trusted them enough to make it. But it also presented complications. The three of them visiting a museum together would raise eyebrows, and would invite exactly the kind of social scrutiny that their current arrangement so carefully avoided. He handed the note to Holmes, who read it with his characteristic speed and precision. "She's testing the boundaries," Holmes observed, "seeing if the friendship that exists in writing can translate into actual physical proximity. It's a natural progression, I suppose, though not without risk for her." "We should go," Watson said immediately. "If she's willing to risk the social complications, the least we can do is support her in that risk." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "You've thought this through? How do we explain the presence of a domestic servant in our company? What will we say if we encounter anyone we know?" Watson hadn't thought it through, actually, but he found himself unwilling to let logistical concerns override what felt like the right thing to do. "We'll simply be three people who share an interest in medieval manuscripts," he said. "If anyone asks, Clara is a research assistant, someone helping you with historical background for a case. That's not so far from the truth, is it? She's been helping me understand how readers engage with my work, which has certainly improved my writing." Holmes smiled, that rare expression of genuine warmth. "Very well, I'm convinced. And you're right. She's been more valuable to your development as a writer than a dozen literary critics. Let's grant her this request." They arranged to meet Clara on a Saturday afternoon, the following week, at the main entrance to the British Museum. Watson suggested this in a note he left for her, emphasizing that she should feel no obligation, that there would be no awkwardness if she changed her mind. But when Saturday arrived, cold and clear with a pale winter sun struggling through thin clouds, Clara was waiting at the designated spot dressed in her best dress, still clearly that of a working woman, but clean and well-maintained, with a coat that looked new, or at least carefully preserved. She looked nervous, Watson thought, her hands clasped tightly together, her posture a mixture of determination and uncertainty. But when she saw them approaching, her face transformed with a smile of such genuine pleasure that Watson felt his concerns about social propriety evaporate like fog in sunlight. "Dr. Watson, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Thank you for this. Truly. I've wanted to see this exhibition since I read about it, but I never quite had the courage to come alone." "The courage to enter a museum?" Holmes asked with gentle curiosity. "Surely you've visited before?" Clara's smile became slightly rueful. "I have, but always with a sense that I'm trespassing somehow, that someone will question my right to be there. People in my class don't typically spend their free afternoons looking at illuminated manuscripts, Mr. Holmes. We're supposed to be shopping at markets or attending services at church or doing any of a dozen other respectable, humble activities. Intellectual curiosity isn't considered appropriate for domestic servants." "Then society is absurd," Watson said firmly, "and we're well rid of its expectations. Shall we go in?" The British Museum enveloped them in its vast, echoing spaces, all marble and grandeur and the accumulated weight of human civilization carefully catalogued and preserved. The illuminated manuscripts were housed in a special gallery, the lighting carefully controlled to protect the delicate pigments and gold leaf from deterioration. Watson watched Clara's face as they entered the exhibition, and saw her eyes widen with wonder at the first display case. The manuscripts were indeed remarkable, Pages from prayer books and gospels created by monks who had spent lifetimes perfecting their art, transforming words into visual symphonies of colour and form. The illuminated letters bloomed like gardens, intricate vines and flowers and fantastical creatures woven around Latin text, gold leaf catching the light and seeming to glow with its own internal illumination. Clara moved from case to case with a kind of reverence, bending close to examine the details, reading the explanatory placards with careful attention. Watson found himself watching her as much as the manuscripts, fascinated by her engagement, by the way she absorbed information and made connections. "Look at this," she said softly, gesturing to a particularly elaborate page. The monk who created this spent months on just this one page, probably. All that time and skill devoted to making the Word of God beautiful. It's a kind of worship, isn't it? Making something with such care and attention that the work itself becomes a prayer. Not unlike your own work with pressed flowers, Holmes observed. You're creating beauty from nature and preserving it between pages. The principle is similar, even if the scale differs. Clara looked at Holmes with surprise, as if she hadn't expected him to draw such a connection. "I never thought of it that way," she said slowly. "But perhaps you're right. Perhaps any work done with love and attention is a kind of worship, regardless of whether it's creating illuminated manuscripts or pressing flowers or writing stories," Watson finished gently, "or reading them with the kind of attention you give to my accounts. You transform my words through your engagement with them, Clara. You make them mean more than they did when I wrote them." She blushed, ducking her head, but Watson could see she was pleased. They continued through the exhibition, the three of them forming an unlikely constellation, the detective, the doctor, and the domestic servant, united by their shared appreciation for beauty and craftsmanship, and the ways that humans have always tried to make meaning through art and attention. They spent nearly 2 hours in the museum, and when they finally emerged into the winter afternoon, the sun already beginning its early descent toward the horizon, Watson felt as if something had shifted. Some barrier had dissolved. The friendship that had existed in writing had proven it could exist in the world as well, and could survive the translation from page to presence. "Thank you," Clara said again as they stood on the museum steps preparing to part ways. "This has meant more to me than I can properly express. To be able to share this experience with people who understand why it matters, it's a gift I'll treasure." "The gift is mutual," Watson assured her. "Your perspective enriches everything you engage with, Clara. Never doubt that." She smiled, that same transformation of her features he'd witnessed before, and then she was gone, disappearing into the London crowds with the practiced invisibility of someone who had spent a lifetime learning to move through the world unnoticed. The weeks that followed seemed to glow with a particular warmth, despite the deepening cold of winter. The Bookmark continued its travels, but now the notes it carried referenced shared experiences as well as shared reading. Clara mentioned details from the museum visit, made connections between the illuminated manuscripts and passages in Watson's stories, shared other exhibitions and lectures she hoped they might someday attend together. Christmas came and went, marked in the Bookmark's journey by a small sprig of holly that Clara pressed between pages, accompanied by a note wishing them both joy and peace. Watson, in turn, left her a small book, a collection of poetry by Christina Rossetti, with an inscription thanking her for enriching his life and his work. He didn't give it to her directly, of course. That would have been too forward, too presumptuous. Instead, he left it on his desk with a note indicating it was for her, and it disappeared the next time she came to clean, replaced by a brief note of such profound gratitude that Watson felt his eyes grow damp reading it. The new year arrived, 1894, sweeping away 1893 with the usual mixture of nostalgia and hope, and Watson found himself reflecting on how much had changed in such a short time. A missing bookmark had led to a mystery, and that mystery had led to a friendship, and that friendship had transformed his understanding of his own work and purpose. He was no longer writing just to chronicle Holmes's cases or to earn income from publication. He was writing to communicate with someone who truly listened, who paid attention not just to what was said but to how it was said, who engaged with his words in a way that made them matter more deeply than he'd ever imagined they could. "You're smiling at your manuscript," Holmes observed one evening in mid-January. "That's new." Watson looked up, realizing he had indeed been smiling as he wrote. "I suppose I am," he admitted. I was thinking about how Clara will read this passage, what she'll notice in it, how she might respond. It makes the writing feel less solitary somehow, like I'm having a conversation even as I'm working alone. All writing is conversation, Holmes said thoughtfully. The writer speaks, the reader responds, even if that response is silent and the writer never hears it. But you've been fortunate enough to hear Clara's responses, to know that your words are landing somewhere, taking root, growing into something meaningful. Most writers never receive that gift. No, Watson agreed. Most writers don't. I'm extraordinarily lucky. He looked at his bookmark resting beside his current work in progress. A new account of one of Holmes's cases that he was still shaping, still refining. The bookmark looked the same as it always had, worn brown leather with his initials tooled on one side, but it had become so much more than a simple tool for marking one's place in a text. It had become a messenger, a bridge, a symbol of the connection that could exist between reader and writer when both parties approached the exchange with attention and care and genuine respect. It had travelled between Watson's hands and Clara's hands dozens of times now, carrying messages of appreciation and encouragement and the shared joy of engaging deeply with words and ideas. The bookmark had witnessed a friendship forming in the margins of daily life, in the spaces between work and sleep, in the quiet moments when people reached across the distances that separated them to say, "I see you, you matter, your attention is valued." That night, as Watson prepared for bed, he placed the bookmark carefully in the novel he was currently reading, a new work by Hardy that Clara had mentioned wanting to read. In the morning, he would leave the book on his desk with a note suggesting she borrow it, another small gift in the ongoing exchange that had enriched both their lives. Outside, London slept its vast, complicated sleep, millions of dreams unfolding in millions of rooms, most of them never touching, never connecting, ships passing in the night. But here, in 221B Baker Street, a connection had been made and nurtured and allowed to grow into something genuine and valuable. A bookmark had gone missing, and in its travels it had found something far more important than its original place in a text. It had found purpose. It had found meaning. It had become the vehicle for a conversation that transcended the boundaries society tried to impose, that proved attention and intelligence and appreciation knew no class, no station, no rigid social hierarchy. Watson smiled as he extinguished his lamp, the darkness settling around him like a familiar blanket. Somewhere in London, Clara was probably reading by candlelight, carefully turning pages, pressing flowers, thinking about stories and their meanings. And tomorrow the bookmark would continue its journey, carrying new messages, building new bridges, proving again and again that the simplest objects could become the vehicles for the most profound connections. The bookmark's legacy wasn't just in what it marked or where it travelled. Its legacy was in what it made possible, the recognition that every reader matters, that every act of attention is a gift, that being truly seen is one of the most wonderful things in the world. And as Watson drifted towards sleep, he thought about the story he would write next, the words he would craft knowing Clara would read them, the conversation he would continue through the only language that had ever really mattered, the language of stories, carefully told, gratefully received, and treasured on both sides of the page. The bookmark rested in its book, waiting for morning, waiting to travel again, waiting to carry new messages between two people who had learned that friendship could exist in the most unexpected spaces, could flourish in the margins, could transform the simple act of reading and writing into something that made both their lives immeasurably richer. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent and eternal. But inside 221B Baker Street, where a bookmark had once gone missing, and in doing so had revealed a beautiful mystery, Watson dreamed of words and flowers and the quiet reader who had shown him what his stories truly meant. And the bookmark, that faithful leather strip that had started it all, waited patiently to continue its work, carrying attention and appreciation and recognition across the small but significant distance between a writer and his most faithful reader. The mystery was solved. The conversation would continue, and the bookmark's legacy would live on in every story Watson wrote, in every note Clara left, in every pressed flower and newspaper clipping and small gesture of connection that proved again and again, that being seen is everything, and that sometimes the smallest objects carry the greatest meanings. Sleep well, London, dream your dreams, and tomorrow the bookmark will travel again. That's our story tonight. Are you drifting off beneath the glowing skyline of Toronto, the ocean hush of Mauritius, the moonlit rooftops of Athens, or the quiet beauty of Oslo? If this tale brought you peace, like the episode and subscribe for more nights like this. Let the stillness wrap around you. Let your dreams drift gently through the night. Sleep gently now, wherever you are in this wide and wondrous world.